Hello, everybody, and welcome to a really special episode of JTV. I'm thrilled to be joined from Israel by Dr. Einat Wilf. Einat, thank you so much for joining us. Really greatly appreciate it. Einat is a former politician. She's now a superb global advocate for Israel, for the Jewish people. And frankly, we often cover content that she's either said or written and videos, is frankly one of the most articulate voices for the cause of Israel out there. And I'm so grateful to be speaking to her live. Einat, the first thing I want to ask you, actually, before we talk about things relating to the war and questions about moving forward and the Palestinian issue and all that, I'm curious just to know a bit more about you and your own journey. Obviously, you were part of the Labour Party when you were in the Knesset, and you describe yourself as a sort of more of a liberal Zionist. I'm curious, have your views evolved over the years, and particularly in light of what happened last October?
So I've definitely grown up in the Israeli peace camp with a very basic hypothesis that was that brought together the entire Israeli left and peace camp, which is that we have a path to peace, and that the path to peace is based on a very simple exchange of land for peace. Specifically, the lands that Israel has acquired as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War. I believed, as part of this hypothesis, that the only thing that is standing between us and peace is the occupation, the settlements, and that if we only ended them, if we got out of the West Bank and Gaza, if we removed the settlements, we would have peace. My hypothesis was that the Palestinians were a people fighting against the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, that they were therefore fighting a legitimate battle with the limited goal of establishing a state of themselves in those territories once Israel got out of them. So as a result, I voted for all the prime ministers that fulfill this goal, from Rabin to Barak to Olmert. I supported the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. So this is about kind of a 25-year commitment to this idea, both politically and individually. But as with a lot of hypotheses, at one point they have to meet evidence and reality. And what happened is that reality was increasingly at odds with the hypothesis, precisely because we had Israeli prime ministers who were putting the hypothesis to the test. They actually offered Palestinians a state, end of the occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem. Most notably, Ehud Barak to Arafat in the year 2000, Ehud Olmert to Abu Mazen in the year 2008. And as I watched Arafat and Abu Mazen, each in their time, walk away from these offers, from these clear and concrete opportunity to establish Palestinian statehood, no settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem. And not only did they walk away from these opportunities, there was no internal debate or dissenting voices among Palestinians on that issue. And it was always followed up with brutal violence, especially in the years 2001, 2, 3, 4, which were misnamed the Second Intifada, but were just a campaign of wanton violence in our streets.
Why do you say
And
misnamed?
because people imagine Intifada as this like gentle shaking off. The first Intifada was, even though it was violent, was more associated with people seeking to end the occupation, whereas the second Intifada was actually, they had a chance to finish the occupation, they walked away from it, and they just went on this rampage of killings and massacres by means of suicide bombers in our streets, buses, hotels, cafes. So people try, you hear today in university campuses or in demonstrations, globalize the Intifada or Intifada revolution. And when Jews especially are horrified by that, they are often being gaslighted to and told that no, globalizing the intifada, I mean, this is just like a revolution. This is a gentle shaking off. But if you're an Israeli, and especially an Israeli Jew, who had lived through the early years of the 21st century in Israel, you have a very visceral sense, and a very traumatic one, of what an intifada is. Just really wanton massacre, deliberately aimed at civilians as they go about their civilian lives, sitting in cafes and going on a bus. So, with reality essentially disproving the hypothesis, because had the Palestinians only wanted a state and to the occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, well, they had the opportunity to take it. If that is what they wanted, you would have expected dissenting voices. You would have expected a domestic Palestinian debate saying, why are you not taking what we wanted? And when all of these things were not in existence and the violence, I began basically to ask the question that almost every scientist asked when their hypothesis collapsed is like, okay, what alternative hypothesis could best fit all the data that I now have, all the evidence? And during that time, I collected even more data. I met with Palestinians. I did the research that became the book, The War of Return, with Adi Schwartz. And I realized that actually the new hypotheses were quite simple. It was literally staring us in the face, um, hiding in plain sight, as they say, because Palestinians always told us what they wanted. We just didn't want to listen to them, or when we did listen, it sounded so outrageous that we didn't take them seriously. But they told us from the river to the sea, that they told us repeatedly that their vision is one where the Jews don't have a state anywhere in the land, not in the pre-67 lines, not small, not big, with or without the West Bank, with or without Gaza. Their key priority was no Jewish state. As I did the research that ultimately became the book, I came across a quote that I've been using in all my talks ever since, because it's the entirety of this hypothesis in one sentence. It's by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. He's not a friend of the Jewish people, certainly not of those who wanted sovereignty. And this is a speech he gives in February 47. And the reason that I emphasize the date is that this is a moment, February 47, when there's no occupation, no settlements, no blockade in Gaza, there's no Bibi, there's no right-wing government. I mean, there's no refugees, there's no state of Israel for that matter. So all the excuses, all the things that we are told are the reasons for the conflict don't exist. And yet, Bevin, in trying to explain why Britain failed the trust it was given unanimously by the League of Nations to help the Jews achieve sovereignty, he says His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. He calls it irreconcilable in February 47, and he goes on to say, the Jews and Arabs in the land, those are the Arabs that will later in the 60s be called Palestinians. He says the Jews and Arabs each have something that they value above all else. They have a top priority. He says for the Jews, it's to establish a sovereign Jewish state. So the Jews want a state based on the principle of self-determination. And he goes on to say the Arabs, and these are those who will be called Palestinians, he's like, their top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. So he's not saying, look, the Jews want to stay, the Arabs want to stay, and we just need to know how to divide the territory between them. That was the previous hypothesis I had, right? That it's only a matter of territory and dividing the land. He's saying that as a matter of top priority, it's more important for the Arabs, the Palestinians, to not have a Jewish state than it is for them to have their own. And this has made me realize that this is the alternative hypothesis. And I can say it has yet to be disproved. If anything, you talked about October 7th, it has been brutally proven that whenever Palestinians face the choice to build something for themselves, as in when Israel got out of Gaza in 2005. It was always more important for them to ensure that the Jews don't have a state, which is why they weaponized the entire landscape of Gaza for this singular purpose of trying to destroy the Jewish state, rather than to go about building a state for themselves next to the Jewish state. Um, so I don't even, sometimes people talk about it as changing an ideology, or, you've moved from the left to the right. I still very much consider myself a lefty on anything from social issues to economic issues. And I even will say, in the continued desire for peace and the continued willingness to divide the territory on the day, if one day Arabs indeed decide that it's more important for them to build for themselves rather than destroy for us. So in that sense, I very much continue to call myself someone of the left, of the peace camp. Sometimes I call myself a long-term peace activist. It's just that in the face of evidence, I had to change my reigning hypothesis that what stands between us and peace is territory, settlements, occupation. Those are all elements of territory, to a different hypothesis that says that what stands between us and peace is actually the Arab and especially Palestinian obsession with destroying the Jewish state. And that has to disappear before we can have peace.
Okay, so then the next obvious question would be, what do you put down as the root cause for why they so object to Jewish sovereignty in their ancient homeland?
So there's all kinds of causes. Some would talk about demographic changes. They did not appreciate seeing more Jews in this midst, but that's a small thing and would not account for the depth of the obsession. I would, at the end, give 80% at least, if not more, to the fact that Zionism, in seeking equality and dignity and self-determination for the Jews, challenged something fundamental in the world order of the Arabs and Muslims in the region. We need to remember that by the time that Zionism begins, not as like an aspiration or a longing, but as an actual political program in the end of the 19th century to achieve self-determination, right? This is the moment of the rise of nations to replace empires. Self-determination is becoming increasingly the universal principle to replace empires. So as the Jews begin to organize themselves around the principle of self-determination with a specific political program to become a sovereign people in their ancient homeland, by that point, the Arabs and Muslims who, thanks to the 7th century conquests, have become dominant in the North Africa, the Levant, the Middle East, they have only known for the preceding 12, 13 centuries only one kind of Jew. Because unlike Christianity, Islam comes 7 centuries later. So by the time Islam and the Arab conquests appear on the world stage, the Jews have already been dispossessed and exiled by the Roman Empire. So the Arabs and Muslims actually only meet one kind of Jew, the Jew who is weak, powerless, dispossessed, exiled. And in their mind, it actually becomes the natural condition of being Jewish. And it becomes embedded in their entire social and religious structure. The idea that Jews are a people of lower status called dhimmi, who are protected, sometimes more, sometimes less, but by Arab and Muslim rulers. So imagine that for 1200, 1300, 1400 years, you only know Jews as your inferiors, and you come to accept it as the natural order of things. This is the proper role of the Jew, the only role of the Jew, to be beneath you. That is how a proper society is organized. And then imagine that you have a small group of people who are essentially challenging your entire way of life by claiming to be your equals. Like Zionism is basically the Jewish claim that they are no more and no less than the Arabs and Muslims, both collectively and individually. In any society, a challenge to a hierarchical order is always met with violence, always. And the violence is intended to essentially put those who dare challenge their lower status back in their so-called place. So I believe that the obsession, the Arab and Muslim obsession with essentially with Zionism, with the Jewish state, is a desire to put the Jews back where they belong, back in their proper and lower inferior place. The tragedy, the danger is that in the last century, this Arab Muslim understanding of the proper place of the Jews has become enmeshed as a result of some European and British colonialism, as a result of the insertion of Nazi propaganda and the very deep and close collaboration between the Arab Palestinians and the Nazis and the Arabs during the 30s and 40s, as a result of UNRWA, the organization that I study. What happens is that this Arab Muslim understanding of the Jews as inferior and the violent desire to put them back in their place became enmeshed with the Christian and secular Western, but it is essentially a secularized Christian vision, or at least one branch of Christianity, uh, of a theological opposition to Jews, to sovereign Jews, as something that is almost theological, that has to do with not just about a social, political, semi-religious order, but a real kind of world order of good and evil, where evil always has to stand on the side of collective Jew. And this has all now become one big, tragic mess.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that theological part there as well, because I feel that if we can't ignore the fact that it is the world of monotheism that often is at odds with the Jews. And if the basic fundamental narrative of the Islamic world is that they have almost become the new emissaries of God, that Islam has superseded Judaism, and that the Jews are forsaken by God. They're scattered around, the wandering Jew, they're scattered all over the earth. What does it do to your narrative when suddenly the Jews return to their homeland, reestablish their dignity and sovereignty, and it's like, God's promise is still being kept with the Jews? So that would be so threatening and humiliating to their side. And surely that has got to play a big part in what's going on here.
What you described is literally the Christian theology. Because Christianity came directly from Judaism, made a direct claim to supersede it, it developed the kind of theology that you described. It developed the theology that basically looks at the continued exile, wandering, dispossession, and humiliation of the Jews as essential proof that indeed they are no longer chosen, they are no longer loved. In fact, it is only with the emergence of Reformation and Restorationism in the 17th century that you began to have a Christian branch that had a different theology, that actually saw the restoration of the Jews as not being at odds with Christianity, but being in support of it. Islam, because it comes 6th, 7th century later, doesn't have that same theological intensity. They mostly come onto the stage already when it's done. This is why you can even see it in buildings. In Jerusalem, the early Christian churches were built to overlook the ruins of the temple. So this is why otherwise you would expect there to be a church on the Temple Mount, right? It's the highest place. This is like the first place you would expect a church, right? The reason there's no church on the Temple Mount is that the Christian theology initially was about looking at Jewish ruin literally looking at Jewish ruin as essential to its theology. So Jewish ruin had to be kept as a ruin, which is why when the Muslims and Arabs come in the 7th century, the Temple Mount is basically free and ruined for them to build their mosques and shrines. So you actually can see that difference. And for Christianity, the ruin, the desolation of the Jew was necessary. For Islam, it was a given. They didn't have to prove it, to incorporate it. It was just how things were. But you are right that we are finding ourselves at this very dangerous moment where the Arab Muslim history of knowing Jews as inferior, desolate, exiled, and the Christian theology of seeing their desolation as necessary have come together in the almost secular theology of Palestinianism and anti-Zionism to create a very dangerous brew. And you're absolutely right that at the end of the day, even when it's secularized, I have a colleague, Mati Friedman, said that people in the West today have become so removed from religion that they don't know religion when it stares them in the eye. Like they don't understand that their obsession with Palestinianism, anti-Zionism, woke theology, and salvation are a religion. He's like, they just don't this is literally what a religion looks like, with good and evil, sin, salvation.
Holy books.
And what?
Holy books.
Exactly. And catechisms, doctrine, people that you kind of send to that away from your community for being going against the doctrine. So of course this is a secularized form of religion. Tom Holland wrote a wonderful book called Dominion: How Christianity Made the West, really showing how even when secularized, at the end of the day, it sits on deep theological issues. So you're right. For example, when I explain that anti-Semitism, I don't explain it as a conspiracy or a hatred or a prejudice. I explain that it's the political scapegoating mechanism of societies in crisis. So sometimes people tell me, okay, we get the scapegoating mechanism. We understand the need of societies to find someone to blame for their crisis. It's easier to blame someone than to actually do the hard work of fixing the problem. He says, but why the Jews? And I say that indeed, in societies that were based on the supersession of the Jews, it's just available. Let's say you were to explain that the crisis in your society is because people who are over 6 feet tall. You would need to do a lot of explaining why people who are over 6 feet tall are behind the current crisis. But all you need to do is say, Zionists, the children in Gaza, and you are tapping into a wealth of cultural capital that has been built over millennia. The idea of Jewish bloodlust for the blood of non-Jewish children. The idea that this bloodlust is ritualistic, ingrained. The idea of Zionists using their money behind the scenes to go against the desire of the common man. So you don't need to do much in order to just tap into that. And you're right. If you wanted to be in India on the Hindu side, and you wanted to blame the Jews, it would be a bit harder.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you talk also about how you're, the shifting in your hypothesis. And for me, I feel like it's become very clear that the Palestinian cause, the identity, is not wrapped up in genuine desire for self-determination and statehood. It's about wanting to kill off the Jewish state and Jewish security and all of that. And therefore, I have to wonder personally, I feel like that given that fact, pushing for a two-state solution is simply calling for Israel's destruction, because the identity from its very inception till today is not centered around genuine nationalism. And I wonder whether in some ways pushing for that and pushing for calls to maybe let's find a way to divide the land, that just perpetuates the problem because you're perpetuating a false, hateful narrative. And therefore, I wonder what, is it better for us just to say, look, this, you don't even have a genuine desire for a state here. You just want to kill us. Therefore, let's just have sovereignty over all of the land, which, frankly, historically, biblically, legally, is ours.
So I separated between two things. First of all, I agree completely that we need to introduce a very fundamental condition of any talk of a two-state solution or any kind of political resolution that says, a bit like you said, that we need to know that this is what they want. Like, you can't want for them what they've never wanted for themselves. So I often phrase it by saying, of course, the day that the Arabs, Palestinians, end their more than century-long war against Zionism, the day that they decide that it's more important for them to build for themselves rather than destroy for others, the day that they understand that they are not refugees, there's no return, they are guaranteed to find in the Jewish people and in the state of Israel a partner for peace, willing to live side by side, but not a minute before. So I find it valuable to, first of all, just indeed place the burden of proof where it actually belongs. And seems that so many are just shying away from just very clearly placing the burden of proof. Now, what you talk about in terms of, okay, let's just annex all of it, the problem, of course, as has been for quite some time, and in many ways goes back to the very successful Arab Palestinian violent attempt in the 1930s to prevent Jewish immigration and the establishment of a Jewish state. You know, a lot of people make the mistake thinking that Israel was established in some perverse way thanks to the Holocaust, like by some guilty nations. And I always have to explain to people nations were not guilty after World War II. And actually, the reigning sense was that there will not be a Jewish state for the pretty obvious reason that there were no more Jews. Um, and the reason is that the Jewish state, you know, people say never again. But if you look at Herzl's writings, the early Zionists, Israel was supposed to be established so that never at all. That was how prescient and genius Herzl was. He understood at the end of the 19th century, when Vienna was the best place for Jews, Jews were scaling the heights of culture and every part of it, and journalism. And so he already understands that Jews have to pursue self-determination, to be able to not be at the mercy of others, to be masters of their fate. So Israel was supposed to be established so that never at all, not so that never again. The never again is actually a failure in many ways of Zionism to have the state in the 20s and the 30s. And one of the reasons for that failure is Arab violence. Again, those are the Arabs that will later be called Palestinians, who successfully used violence to ultimately lead the British, who were entrusted unanimously by the League of Nations to help the Jews achieve sovereignty. And basically, the Arab violence caused the British to cave, and essentially betray a trust that they received unanimously from the League of Nations. And as a result, the gates to what should have been the Jewish state in the 30s were closed to the Jewish people at the most crucial moment in Jewish history. So as a result, we just didn't have enough Jews. This is why the Jews ultimately accept partition, because they don't have enough Jews for the sovereign Jewish state that was supposed to be in the area. And unfortunately, that's still the case. You know, some people who come to the right and tell me, well, the settlements are going to change that. I'm like, I don't know if you are aware, but the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the West Bank has not changed from the 90s to the present. That's it. You're the same, I don't know, 13%. So the purpose of Zionism was not to be a Jewish minority in an Arab state. And we know how that ends. That's not our purpose. Our purpose, first and foremost, and remains, is to be sovereign. is to be able to be masters of our fate in a nation state of our own. And that means that it cannot be the entire territory from the river to the sea. I have a colleague who, together, we wrote some essays, Dr. Shani Moore, where we called it 80-80. We said Israel should lock its borders now to something that is essentially 80% of the territory that would enjoy an 80% solid Jewish majority. Um, so the issue is not whether we have a legal right. Yeah, I can make the legal case of why, because Arabs never accepted any agreement, any partition. The only legal thing that is in place is the League of Nations, and the Jews have the right from the river to the sea. I can make the legal case. I can make the historical case, the emotional case, all of that. But at the end of the day, they are all, in my view, subjected to the far more important goal of sovereignty. And sovereignty is not to be a Jewish minority in an Arab state.
Are you saying that would be the case even if Israel decided they're going to remove certain democratic rights in order to maintain its Jewish status and maintain sovereignty? Or are you saying even if they did that, the fact that you'd have Jews not as overwhelming majority is in and of itself a problem?
I would say both. I would say that this is, even if you go to kind of very people on the extreme right who basically say, you know what, we don't care. We will actually have a situation where we annex the territory and the Arab residents will not have voting rights. They will not be citizens. Even that is a way of kidding yourself. At the
Killing
end of the
yourself.
day, you are what? Yes, because you're still a Jewish minority in an Arab state. So you're trying to pretend that you're not, but you are. Um, in many ways, we are speaking now as the
Isn't that like
ICJ
Jordan
is
though?
what?
Isn't Jordan governed by a
Yes, which
minority?
is always, which pretty much exists with our support.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, those are not. This is not what we want to be. This is not how we will survive. Um, the Israel fundamentally, these are not high ideals. We are in a situation precisely because we have real enemies who want our non existence. Is that anything less than excellence, anything less than operating at the top of our game, leads to our end. Israel doesn't have a scenario by which it is a Jordan, by which it descends gently into third world existence, because we've seen it in the last year when we had a government, a leadership who thought they could play fast and loose with Israel, who thought that they could put mediocrities in every position of government, and I'm being super generous in calling them mediocrities, who thought they can gut our civil service, our politics, our institutions, and Israel would survive. If we are anything less than excellent, less than a first world country, less than a place that is a magnet for Jewish creativity and thriving, then we are basically slaughtered. It's as simple as that.
The problem is, I simply cannot. I don't even think we can trust a Palestinian side anymore that may one day in the future say, no, we really genuinely are partners for peace now. Because it's been nearly 100 years, because the identity is so clearly about hate, because we have tried so many times to trust and we extend our hand and it's, and then in some ways, as I said before, I do feel that in some ways we're actually perpetuating their narrative by constantly saying, yes, you're right, it's not our land. And then I suppose on the other side, you will have people who, so you'll basically will have people on the other side who are saying, we won't be a full democracy to maintain our Jewishness. And maybe there are even some people who are saying they're calling for expulsion, presumably, as the only other solution.
Yes, and again, all of these things fail to understand. One of the genius of Zionism from the beginning is, again, from the beginning, it worked at the highest level of excellence. It was top people, people left universities in Berlin to work the land. It was basically fired by high ideals, by a sense of excellence from the beginning. The institutions we created of universal health care and public education, all of them created in the early 20th century, they were the institutions of people who understood that nothing less than excellence will allow us to realize that crazy dream. When I say people are playing fast and loose with the achievements of Zionism, again, I have a colleague who says we have people who have been living off the interest for too long. They actually have no sense of how much excellence and effort and mobilization went into building what they thought they can, building the capital, and they think they could live off the interest, not giving anything to it. So you are right on the issue of trust. In fact, we are so desperate for peace that we have been willing to accept lower standards. That is something that I completely speak against. I've actually made it very clear. You're saying we cannot trust the Palestinians, and I say actually we can trust them, because amazingly on this issue, they never lie. They will lie on everything from genocide to famine to Gaza as an open air prison, blah, blah, blah. Where they will not lie is on the idea that their core ethos negates Jewish sovereignty. Sometimes they use different words on that. Actually, I'm doing now these like short videos with Elon Levy's Israeli spokesperson, civilian spokesman initiative. My most recent video exactly talks to that they do not lie. And precisely because they do not lie, it's actually possible to know when they have been transformed, because they will actually say the things that right now they are incapable of even uttering. So that's one thing. And I would say more broadly, two things. First, people have been transformed in the course of history. So just that's a basic human notion. People change, societies change, sometimes for the long run, but they do change. The notion that human beings are forever the same is empirically wrong. And within that, I can say is that, yes, we have closed our eyes for decades, allowing ourselves to actually feed this Palestinian identity. This is why I've devoted so much of my time to UNRWA, which to many appears like a fringe obsession, until you begin to understand that this is the core organization that funnels UN legitimacy and Western money to the building of a Palestinian identity that is focused on destroying the Jewish state. We have within Israel leaders still today who think that it's okay to continue working with UNRWA and we need to fund it. And so we continue to downplay how serious the Palestinians are. And in that sense, I agree with you. I think we need to do two things on both ends. We need to stop downplaying how serious the Palestinians are about our destruction. And we need to be very clear that the burden of proof is on them to show that they've changed, and that we are setting the bar very high in showing that they have been transformed, and that any talks of two states is only after that transformation takes place, not in any interim phase, not a minute before.
I hear that. My gut instinct feels that actually the very notion of two states is always inherently going to encourage their belief that we don't really have a right to be there, that they want to dismantle it. That's how I feel is the message that we send to them, by basically saying that, as you say, this ancient historical biblical plot of land, really we kind of want to split it up. And I also hear about, and I do hear this notion that people can change, but I do also wonder when we think about excellence. On the one hand, I hear the argument of we've always got to extend our hand out, we've always got to extend our hand to peace. On the other hand, I sort of feel that there does come a point where after so long of trying a certain strategies, trying a certain hypothesis, and doing all these things, giving away Gaza, all these solutions, partitions, all that, there does come a point where you have to say this is never ending, and constantly maintaining this status quo where our people are dying and they just want to get rid of us is unacceptable. And yes, it may be totally unpalatable, this, like, the more extreme ideas that you have in terms of saying we have to remove certain democratic rights, annexation, expulsion, all these things. But I feel at a certain point, if you're dealing with a people who have majority held Nazi-esque views about you, sometimes you have to say enough's enough. So I don't know. I'm not a policymaker, but I don't think that this notion that some of these more aggressive approaches to a people who are simply willing your destruction, to say that it somehow becomes immoral or no longer has excellence, when it's really a matter of life and death, I'm not so sure I'd agree with it. Agree with those concerns.
I understand, but especially if you talk about, I mean, precisely because of what you're saying, I don't see why you want them so much to be within your state so clearly, because ultimately, if they're within your state, they are within your state forever.
Or maybe
Um,
a resettlement program throughout the masses and masses of land in the Arab world, which they so deeply associate with.
Again, you're welcome to try that, but we've even seen, I mean, we even saw that the fundamentally Egypt would not let people flee during war. So I understand the desperation, but precisely because you said something about Nazi-esque, look at Germany. Yes, they had not Nazi-esque. They had actually Nazi ideas. And yet there was an understanding that you can rebuild that society through harsh measures, through creating clear standards. But ultimately, Germany was not emptied of its people. There were 14 million Germans were moved out of what became Western Poland, and that was part of it. But in terms of the ideology, it was understood that at the end of the day, the ideology had to go. I will even say something more. Uh, if we just look at the people rather than the ideology, we are failing to appreciate the danger, because if the people go anywhere with the ideology, they are as dangerous to us everywhere, because that ideology is a threat to us. So we need to battle that entire ideology. It's not just
Mm.
people. And in this, I agree with you. I believe I've said nothing that is status quo. On the contrary, a lot of my criticism was the notion, that's my criticism for years. I have by now books, essays, lectures, meetings where I am on record saying you are feeding an ideology that we will pay for in blood. Meeting with people in the Israeli military, trying to convince our prime minister, this government, Western capitals, that this is not a steady state situation. I would tell them, this is not status quo, this is not steady state. You are pressing air into a balloon that will explode and which we will pay for in blood.
Mm.
And I think now should be the moment to understand that we need to wage a war against the ideology.
Mm.
We need to make it clear that no one can continue holding it. And
Yeah.
that means, for example, within Gaza, from the beginning, I refuse to call what enters Gaza humanitarian aid. We are supplying the enemy at a time of war, and this is because we agreed to tell a lie, which is Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. I compare it to a condition where, in February of 1941, the Americans would have declared war on the kamikazes.
Mm.
No, they went to war against Japan and
Yeah.
were determined to ensure that Imperial Japan, with its entire structural ideology, would be replaced by another Japan. They did not remove the Japanese from Japan, they
Mm.
just made sure it became different.
Yeah.
So we are actually, you keep on saying we tried. I keep saying we actually never tried. We never went head to head with the Palestinian ideology. We kept on looking for shortcuts. Even the two states, even disengagement, they were all shortcuts. We keep on saying, let's first give them a state, let's give them something to lose. And I'm essentially reversing the equation. I'm saying all of these ideas are at the end.
Mm.
Nothing comes before there is a transformation of the ideology.
Yeah.
And it's not something that we sit back and do. We work actively to both remove the fuel that sustains this ideology from UNRWA to Qatar and try to bring in as much as possible fuel that helps them become different.
Right, right. And by the way, I'm not. I fully believe that people can change and that we see evidence of that. I look at Mossab Hassan Youssef, the son of a Hamas co-founder, who was fed on that diet of hate and has changed. And I do believe that one day, I really do believe that we will be best of friends, the Jews and the Arabs in the Middle East. I do believe that's going to happen one day. But where I think we may have perhaps a point of disagreement, I think the way to create that shift in ideology is by a belief that the entirety of the land belongs to the Jewish people. I feel without that, it feeds their fantasy of getting rid of us. But we could talk about this for hours. I actually want to show you a clip because you mentioned UNRWA, which is. So David Lammy is the new Foreign Secretary of the UK, and he's just announced that the UK government is now going to resume funding of UNRWA. This was literally, I think, just yesterday in the UK Parliament. I want to show you what he says because I really would appreciate your response to what he said.
I can confirm to the House that we are overturning the suspension of UNRWA funding. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, humanitarian aid is a moral necessity in the face of such a catastrophe, and it is aid agencies who ensure UK support reaches civilians on the ground. UNRWA is absolutely central to these efforts. No other agency can deliver aid at the scale needed. It's already feeding over half of Gaza's population. It will be vital for future reconstruction, and it provides critical services to Palestinian refugees in the region. I was appalled by the allegations that UNRWA staff were involved in the 7th of October attacks. But the UN took these allegations seriously. I've spoken to UN Secretary General Guterres and Commissioner Lazzarini. We are reassured that after Catherine Colonna's independent review, UNRWA is ensuring they meet the highest standards of neutrality and strengthening its procedures, including on vetting. UNRWA has acted. Partners like Japan, the European Union and Norway have also now acted. This government will act too. I can confirm to the House that we are overturning the suspension of UNRWA funding. Yeah. Britain will provide 21 million in new funds, some directed at supporting the management reforms recommended by the Colonna Review, and UNRWA supports more than 5.5 million Palestinians. Almost 200 of their staff have died through this conflict. I thank them for this life-saving work.
Your reaction?
So I have a talk which people are welcome to look up, where I gave a briefing at the UN, which really explains what UNRWA is. The reason I'm referring to this talk and for people to look it up is because it would take a very long time to refute each and every falsehood. I mean, literally almost everything he says is wrong. UNRWA is not an aid organization. UNRWA is a Palestinian organization devoted to maintaining the idea of a forever war against a Jewish state. Everything else that UNRWA does, social services, education, it does in the service of the goal of maintaining the Palestinians in limbo until there is no Jewish state. That is the actual deep goal of UNRWA. And if you look at the history, it becomes very clear. UNRWA is not an aid organization. UNRWA is not just, it's not about addressing neutrality. UNRWA, by definition, can never be neutral. I actually personally told that to Kelowna by definition, because again, UNRWA is a Palestinian organization run by Palestinians, for the purpose of keeping the Palestinian war against the Jewish state alive. The reason that UNRWA cannot be vital in aid and reconstruction, because the reason we are in need of supposed aid and reconstruction is because of UNRWA. I actually, again, by now I am on record for years with essays, books, saying, don't give $1 into Gaza as long as UNRWA is there, because UNRWA allows Palestinians living in Gaza, 75% of those living in Gaza are registered by UNRWA as if they are still into the 5th generation refugees from the river to the sea, which is why they decided that it's more important for them to weaponize Gaza, the entire strip, in order to take Palestine from the river to the sea, rather than use the money to build something for themselves. So I actually say that it's the cause and effect are as follows. As long as you have UNRWA, you will always have wars, because Palestinians will constantly try to fight the Jewish state. As long as you have UNRWA, you will always have terrorism. UNRWA is literally the infrastructure that always gives birth to new terrorist organizations. It doesn't matter if they're called Fatah, Black September, PFLP, or Hamas. UNRWA is the infrastructure of that. So literally everything he said, every word is wrong. They are not refugees. Everything he said is wrong. And that's, by the way, the reason that I found myself having to write books and essays and lectures and briefings, because we need to dismantle an entire structure of lies that even supposedly smart people in positions of power are parroting. And I have to share with you a darker thought. When I started my journey and I realized the insanity that UNRWA is and how it keeps the war alive. And by the way, to your issue of, if we say 2 states, Palestinians will believe anything, I can assure you that it makes no difference. The things that actually make a difference, the things that do feed the Palestinian vision that Israel will one day not exist, is not when Israel says 2 states or offers its hand in peace or tries to negotiate. What feeds the Palestinian vision are things like UNRWA, that tell them that with Japanese money and British money and UN letters, they are still refugees from Palestine, that they have a right of return. That's what feeds the war. I have to say, in that sense, Israel makes almost no difference. People tell me, oh, we need to build settlements. No, we need to remove settlements. No, we need to annex the West Bank. No, and I always explain to them, I know it's really important for you to feel that we're doing something in that sense, but with territories, without territories, with occupation, without occupation, in Gaza, outside of Gaza, with settlements, without settlements, and we've had all these, the effect on the Arab Palestinian vision that the Jewish state should be gone is a big fat zero. What actually does have an effect are things like UN legitimacy, Western money, and the dark thought, and that's why I focus on UNRWA. The dark thought that I increasingly have after October 7th is that I was sure that when Europeans, Westerners, will be met with the facts of UNRWA. And the thing about the book, The War of Return, is that sure, some people were not happy with our recommendations, dismantle UNRWA, make it clear that Arabs are not refugees, they possess no such thing as a right of return. They might not like the recommendations, but no one has challenged the book on the data, on the facts. The facts are incontrovertible. So increasingly, when I hear someone like Minister Lamy, I begin to wonder, could it be not that they don't understand, that they are blind, but that deep in their guts, they are funding UNRWA not because they don't understand what UNRWA does, but actually because they understand perfectly what UNRWA does. That fundamentally, they have found UNRWA and Palestinianism as a way to outsource the Western ambivalence, shall we say, with the idea of Jewish sovereignty. And that brings us to the beginning of the conversation, that the reason we're such a dangerous situation is that we have the coming together of the Western theology that Jews must be dispossessed and in exile, with the Arab vision of Jews as inferior. And in many ways, I increasingly wonder if UNRWA is almost a theological mechanism of the West outsourcing its unease with Jewish sovereignty to Palestinianism and its forever war on the Jewish state.
Wow, wow. Well, that actually brings me to a quote that you said. You put on Twitter a few months ago in April, which I think ties into all of this, and it really struck with me. You said, "We are reaching a tipping point where the actual situation of real Palestinians will cease to matter, as Palestinianism will have served its purpose as the mask behind which the 75-year incubation, growth, and global unleashing of ideas illegitimate after World War II could take place." Wow. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I do a lot of work on anti-Zionism, how it hides behind Palestinianism. Palestinianism, just to be clear, is what I call the ideology and identity, which is the negation of Jewish self-determination. So Palestinianism has provided, especially with Arab and Soviet support, as a very convenient mask behind which anti-Zionism, which in itself is the respectable mask for the discredited anti-Semitism, in which it could actually be unleashed globally. This is why the Zionism is Racism resolution in the UN, brought through a combination of Soviet and Arab support to the UN, established all the Palestinian mechanisms in the UN, so that even when the resolution itself was repealed in the 90s, the mechanisms still remain. And it's a wonderful mask, because people do not have to be anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. They just have to be supposedly for Palestinian rights, except that Palestinian rights, as conceived in Palestinianism, is the rejection and the undoing of the Jewish state. So what I see after October 7th is really the rise of Palestinianism to a symbolic status where it actually doesn't matter anymore if there are actual solutions to make the life of the Arabs living on the shore of the Mediterranean better, because they are more important for their symbolic status. And recently someone said something that I thought was brilliant. They said, the Palestinian flag has become the new red flag. And when I heard that, I was like, bingo. Because not only does it bring full circle the notion of Palestinianism and the Palestinian identity and anti-Zionism being created in many ways by the Soviet Union and projected globally and inserted into global institutions, it also explains why in Palestinian demonstrations you will not see the national flags of the countries, but in pro-Israel demonstrations you will find British flags, American flags, French flags, Canadian flags, because this is the new universal flag of the global brotherhood and utopia. It can explain why there is queers for Palestine, feminists for Palestine, where people can say what initially sounds moronic. Palestine is everything. Palestine is climate change. Palestine is workers' right. Palestine is fighting against
Abortion
capitalism.
rights, I saw once.
Yeah, which sounds moronic until you understand that the Palestinian flag is the new red flag. And then it falls into place, because yes, that is the new flag of the global utopia. That explains why you have idealistic young Jews participating in it, why you have young people participating in it. It explains the anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism was always essential to the communist utopia because it was always against Jewish particularism. It explains the new placard of "Keep the World Clean," which is one of the most ancient and dangerous ideas, that
Would
there
you
is
agree
a
that it's a
clean
hate flag?
world. What?
Would you agree that it's a hate flag?
I don't know. Do you think that the red flag is a hate flag? I would. I mean, I think certainly for the Jews, it's a hate flag. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
But I think by now, what it became globally is again a flag in the name of which tens of millions of people have been starved and killed and gulagged, if you can use it as a verb. But yes, the understanding that this is the new flag of universal utopia, I think explains a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Einat, we're nearly out of time, and I really, really appreciate all the fascinating insights you've had over this hour. One of the last things I want to touch on is the war and how it's going, and obviously the greater regional issues that are happening. I watched a speech by John Mearsheimer, who is, I think, very hostile to Israel, and he's a foreign policy analyst. I think he was involved in writing the book The Israel Lobby. And he was saying that Israel's in trouble because Israel has lost its escalation dominance, where previously in wars, if they were hit, Israel would always hit back harder. And, whether we look at what's going on with Lebanon and Iran, that isn't happening. I mentioned it to my dad, we were chatting the other day, and he said, yeah, but we didn't have the Iron Dome and things like that in the past. But I wondered, what's your reaction to his comment about that, and also just about the war and how it's going more generally? What are your thoughts?
I might agree with it, but I think the reason we have essentially had to fight this war in a very limited way is precisely because of all the lies that have created, I would say, an atmosphere of appeasement, whereby this is a battle only against Hamas rather than for the defeat of Palestinianism in total. The appeasement mood coming from DC that is trying to pretend that Iran has nothing to do and that the only front is the front against Hamas, and that Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran are kind of incidental to the issue. So I do agree that we haven't been able to prosecute the war in a way that I think would have been effective and shorter. For example, like I said, the massive pressure that we caved into to supply our enemy at a time of war. So when he said that Israel doesn't have that ability, it's not that we don't have that ability in the physical sense, is that there is every effort being made to ensure that we don't have that ability. It's the ICJ case. It's the supplying our enemy at a time of war. It's defining the war as if it's only against Hamas. It's ignoring Iran. And all of that forces us to fight, in many ways, the wrong war. And if you're fighting the wrong war, if you're fighting a war based on a lie that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, then you're going to have limited achievements.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you think we need to be a bit less concerned with the appeasement of international opinion? And
we have to address it in a more sophisticated way, which means from the beginning, for example, we should have said very clearly, I remember that moment when President Biden came to Israel, and we were all very thankful. We thought we would be slaughtered from every direction. That was the Hamas purpose. And he talked about all the evils of what the Palestinians perpetrated. And then he went on to say, but Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And I remember in real time thinking, oh, we're going to pay dearly for this. That was a moment for a more serious leader. I mean, one of the reasons also we're in that mess, the reason we got into it and the reason that we're not getting quickly out of it, is because we're having the worst possible leadership for the Jewish people, and certainly for the state of Israel in the last century. I can't remember a time in Jewish history when we had worse leadership. So if we had a smarter, more sophisticated leader, he would have said, thank you, President Biden, for everything you're doing for us. Unfortunately, we saw it on October 7th. We know it before. The euphoria, the participation, Hamas not only represents the Palestinians, it represents the deepest ethos of the Palestinians for no Jewish state. And in any case, the burden of proof is on them. We don't need to pretend this is true when all the evidence is pointing in the opposite direction. From the participation to the euphoria to the continued support to the fact that no one's bringing back hostages, the burden of proof is on them. That would have been a moment for a leader, a more sophisticated leader, to stand up and say that. But we don't have that kind of leadership now. We have a leadership that caved in to lies and thereby made this war almost impossible.
This is fascinating to me that we have someone that, that comes from originally a very different political wing to Netanyahu and the leadership, who is, and yet you're saying that actually it's like the roles have been reversed. It's like you're saying we need the right thing is to have a far more uncompromising approach and just to state the truth clearly rather than trying to appease and dance around the lies and nonsense narratives that people have. That's really surprising to hear this in a way, especially when Netanyahu is someone that's on the right.
If you'll notice, in everything I do, I try to be very evidence-based. I constantly look at what is the reality, what is the evidence showing us. And this is, by the way, why I insisted. I mean, that same sophisticated leader would have said, I want you to know, President Biden, that we have a sunny vision for life with Palestinians the day that they are done with their century-long war against Zionism. But until that moment comes, we are going to prosecute the war with the understanding that this is their ideology and the burden of proof is on them. That was, I think, the genius. I've studied a lot what the Allies did in World War II. Their genius was to have both the sunny vision. You constantly challenge me on my insistence on a sunny vision, but that was actually essential to their ability to win because they did the two things at once. They had a sunny vision for the world, for democracy, for Germany and Japan, but they also made it clear that if those countries will not abide by that vision, they will be destroyed. And it was the ability to do both things and to work. And I think that goes back to my notion of excellence and leadership. The Jewish people can afford nothing less, first of all, than dealing with the truth and having a leadership that can be sophisticated. And we don't have that now.
And what do you think about there are those who say, and they tend to be more sort of the left-leaning critics that say that the leadership are, elongating the war. And I think it seems to me like it's taking as long as necessary. Also, it's partly dependent on the weapons that are being supplied by America. Like, it's not entirely down to us. Like, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that critique, because I find it it's hard to say such things without prior knowledge of insider dealings and all that.
Oh, of course they're elongating the war, but again, in a different way. They're elongating the war by agreeing to participate in the lie that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, and therefore sending our soldiers on bizarre missions as if they're only trying to destroy Hamas. It has elongated the war in the clearest sense by us supplying our enemy at a time of war. On the first day, we should have said, we're sorry, we made a mistake. We thought we could work with the people of Gaza. We thought that we could have Qatari money go in. We thought that they really just wanted to manage the welfare of their people. We were wrong. All our goodwill went into them weaponizing Gaza. So we're done. This is enemy territory. We're closing the borders completely. They have a border with Egypt. Another place where our leadership has been completely delinquent is in what I call the disappearing border with Egypt. There's a border with Egypt. Call it out. Say, we're not starving the people of Gaza. There's a border with Egypt. Egypt is welcome to supply them. It clearly supplied them generously with weapons and materials for the last few years. So we're closing our borders. We're going to war against Palestinianism until Palestinianism is defeated, and nothing goes in until the hostages come out. I know it's been almost 10 months. I still am horrified that we normalize the idea that you can go into people's beds, invade a country, occupy it, butcher people, kidnap them from their beds, and then the country that was invaded needs to negotiate with you for their release. And everyone's like, yeah, just, go to Doha, go to Paris, and negotiate. The message should have been, nothing goes in until the hostages come out. Burden of proof is on you. Hamas represents you. You want to show us that it doesn't represent you? Bring back the hostages. We're not negotiating. In what world is this like a negotiating situation? So, yes, I agree the war has been dragged on by the absolute bungled leadership of this country.
And just to clarify, just so people are clear, because I think it's also useful for when I'm having future conversations. When you talk about Palestinianism, you don't mean that we're going to war against, because people will confuse that and I think, what you mean? All the Arabs, all the Palestinians? What do you mean by we're going after Palestinianism?
It means that the war only ends. And when I say the war, it's not the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza is an arena. The war is the century-long war that the Arabs, the Palestinians, have been waging against Jewish sovereignty. That war only ends once the Palestinians have completely, up and down throughout their society, have let go of the idea that their goal in life is to destroy Jewish sovereignty. That's the definition of victory.
And that's how you define Palestinianism. So Palestinianism
is the ideology and identity that negates Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land.
Right. Brilliant. Wow. This is a whirlwind of an hour and got through a lot of information. I have no doubt our viewers will be seriously enlightened by your words and by this discussion. Thank you for all you do, really, for advocating for strong Jewish leadership, for evidence-based decision-making, for being prepared to say the truth when so much of the world simply wants to bury their heads in the sand, and frankly, preach fantasies and not look at reality as it actually is. And so for that, I thank you, our viewers thank you, and Einat, we'd love to do this again at some point.
Certainly, my pleasure.
Thank you so much. There's going to be an end screen now and then the video will end. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.